I am Natalie Carter, 29 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family treated me less like a daughter and more like their safety net. Every bill, every crisis, every demand somehow landed on my shoulders. When my sister Veronica planned a luxury escape to the Maldives, she told me it was my duty to watch her kids for 2 weeks while she and her husband enjoyed the ocean villas and infinity pools. My mother agreed, saying family comes first, which really meant I came last. I thought saying no would set me free, but instead it led to the most humiliating night of my life. In a crowded Chicago restaurant with strangers watching, my own mother's hand struck me across the face. That slap didn't just sting, it set off a chain of events no one in my family ever imagined. And what happened after that night is something you'll want to hear until the very end. And it all began with that night, the sound that still echoes in my mind. The sound of it was sharp and humiliating, echoing across the polished floors of the restaurant. For a moment, I thought the clinking of silverware and the steady hum of conversation had stopped altogether. My cheek burned where her hand had landed, a hot sting that spread quickly as though my entire face had been set on fire. I sat frozen, eyes wide, while my mother stood over me, her palms still half lifted as if she could not quite believe what she had done either. The room around us blurred into a haze of startled gasps. A couple at the next table turned to stare, forks hovering in midair. A waiter carrying a tray of cocktails slowed to a stop, uncertain whether to continue past our table. Somewhere in the back, I heard someone whispering loudly enough for me to catch a fragment of disbelief. I did not look at her, not at my sister, not at my brother-in-law, not at anyone. My eyes fixed on the crisp white tablecloth in front of me, on the half-empty glass of water I had been holding only a second before. My hand trembled slightly and drops spilled onto the linen. I wanted desperately for the floor to open beneath me, to swallow me away from every pair of eyes locked on the scene. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a hammer of shame and fury. My throat tightened, but no sound came out. All the years of swallowing words, all the years of being the one who kept the peace, who carried the burden, collapsed in on themselves in that single instant. I lifted my head, finally forcing myself to meet her eyes. My mother's expression was hard, her jaw set, her lips pressed into a thin line of anger and righteousness. She looked at me, not with regret, not with shock, but with the cold certainty of someone who believed she was right. Beside her, Veronica shifted in her chair, eyes darting between us, lips twitching as if she was fighting a smirk. David kept his gaze on the table, shoulders hunched, pretending to study the menu, though everyone knew it was too late for that. My face throbbed, and yet it was the silence that hurt more than the slap itself. The silence of a family that had turned me into their scapegoat, their provider, their punching bag, all without ever saying the words aloud. I heard a child laugh from another table, high and innocent, so out of place against the tension that held mine. Somewhere near the bar, a glass shattered, and the crash startled me back into myself. I realized my hands had curled into fists in my lap, nails biting into skin. I breathed slowly once, then again. The sting on my cheek remained a bright red brand that everyone could see. What they could not see was the shift inside me, something breaking free, something that had been waiting for this moment far too long. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the polished floor. Every eye followed me as I stood. The restaurant seemed unbearably bright, every light above exposing me in sharp relief. I did not say a word, not to my mother, not to Veronica, not to anyone at that table. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked away, could feel the disapproval of strangers who did not know the story, only the spectacle. But under their gaze, under the shame, a different fire began to burn. I reached the entrance, the heavy glass door cool beneath my hand, and paused. For years, I had been the one who stayed quiet, who kept the family together, who accepted the demands no matter how unreasonable. That slap had stripped me of the last shred of illusion. It was no longer about helping or loyalty or duty. It was about control. It was about the way they believed they owned me. I remembered birthdays where my mother barely looked up from fussing over Veronica, and holidays when my father, tired from work, had slipped me an encouraging smile, as if he knew I was the one holding everything together. I remembered babysitting through high school while Veronica went out on dates, covering bills in college when my parents claimed money was too tight, writing checks again and again because they said family comes first. each memory stacked on the other until they pressed down like stones in my chest. My cheeks still stung, but inside I felt something else entirely, something steadier than the fire of anger. It was resolve. I opened the door and the cool night air hit my skin, carrying the smell of rain on the sidewalks and exhaust from the passing traffic. The city felt alive, uncaring of what had just unraveled inside that glowing restaurant. Cars rolled by, horns honked in the distance, someone laughed across the street. Life kept moving as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. I walked slowly down the block, heels tapping against the pavement. My reflection passed in the darkened windows of boutiques closed for the night, a woman with a red mark across her face, shoulders squared, eyes forward. The humiliation still pulsed, but beneath it was clarity. I knew she would expect me to come back. She would expect me to fold like I always had, to apologize, to smooth things over for the sake of peace. My sister would probably laugh about it later, turning the whole evening into a story about how dramatic I had been. David would nod and agree because that was easier than disagreeing with Veronica. But this time was different. This time the slap had drawn a line even they could not erase. As I turned the corner and left the restaurant behind, I felt the weight of years of silence slip from my shoulders. My cheeks still burned, my pride was bruised, but I was no longer the woman who swallowed everything just to keep the family together. From that night forward, I knew I would never remain silent again. I grew up in a modest neighborhood just outside of Chicago, in a small brick house with a maple tree that dropped leaves all over the yard every fall. To anyone passing by, we looked like a typical middle-class family. Dad worked as a project manager at a construction firm, Mom ran the house, and Veronica and I went to school like every other kid on the block. But behind the front door there was always a line drawn in invisible ink between my sister and me. Dad was the steady one, the anchor of the house. When he came home at night, the air seemed lighter, calmer. He had a way of softening Mom's sharp words with a joke or a look that made me feel seen. He encouraged me to study hard, to keep aiming for scholarships, to take pride in the work I put in. But in April of 2014, when I was 20, his heart gave out suddenly. He had been shoveling snow off the driveway, the late spring storm catching us by surprise. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. That day cut our family in half, and what was left was never the same. After Dad passed, Mom leaned harder into Veronica. She clung to her like a lifeline and treated her as if she were the fragile jewel that had to be protected at all costs. I was still there, still helping, still trying to keep things together, but I was more like a spare tire stored away in the trunk, useful only when absolutely needed. I remember one Christmas not long after Dad's funeral. I had kept my grades up, even pushed myself harder, partly because school gave me a sense of control when everything else felt broken. Straight. As across every subject, a professor's note praising my essays, recognition from the dean. Mom barely glanced at the report card when I handed it to her. She set it down on the counter and said that was what she expected from me anyway. That same week, Veronica brought home a D on a math test. Mom sighed, wrapped her arms around her, and said she was proud of her for trying. Then she bought her a new phone to cheer her up. I stood there in the kitchen, the unfairness burning into me like acid, but I said nothing. I'd already learned that pointing it out would only earn me a lecture about not being jealous. It wasn't just school. Veronica had been given the bigger bedroom when we were kids, with the bay window that overlooked the street. I had the smaller one tucked in the back with a view of the fence. She quit piano after 2 months. Mom still praised her for being artistic. I stuck with it for 6 years, played in recitals, and it was brushed aside like background noise. Even birthdays carried the same pattern. When Veronica turned 16, Mom threw her a lavish party at a banquet hall, rented a DJ, the whole neighborhood invited. When I turned 16, Dad had wanted to do something similar, but Mom said money was tight. I ended up with a small cake at home and a sweater I never wore. Dad apologized with his eyes that night, but there was only so much he could do. After he died, that imbalance became the rule. Veronica could stumble, fall, make a mess of her choices, and Mom would bend the world to cushion her. I could succeed, excel, carry the weight, and it was never enough. I was useful, dependable, but never cherished. I started working part-time while in college, helping cover utilities and groceries. Mom said we had to pull together, but the bills I paid were never acknowledged. When Veronica got a part-time job at a boutique and quit 2 weeks later, Mom called her brave for trying. I remember sitting in my room one night exhausted from studying and from the double shift I had just finished at the cafe near campus. I overheard them laughing in the living room, Mom telling Veronica how proud she was of her for focusing on her dreams. I sat there with my textbooks spread across my lap and realized that no matter how hard I worked, I would never hear those words directed at me. The message was clear, and it sank into my bones slowly over the years. My value in that house was conditional. I was there to fill the gaps, to pay when there was a shortfall, to pick up the slack when Veronica floundered. Love came easily for her, endlessly replenished, no matter how little she gave in return. For me, it had to be earned, and even then, it rarely arrived. I thought often about the night Dad died, about the way he had clutched his chest and collapsed onto the snow. I thought about how different everything might have been if he had lived, if his steady presence had balanced out Mom's favoritism. But life had gone the other way, and I was left to play the role I never chose. When I look back on those years now, I see how they carved me into who I became. The long hours, the invisible labor, the quiet acceptance taught me resilience, yes, but they also taught me silence. I learned to swallow my words, to nod and comply, because that was the only way to keep the fragile peace in a house where love had always been uneven. It was only later, standing in that restaurant with my cheek burning from my mother's hand, that I finally understood the truth that had been under my skin since childhood. Affection in my family was never unconditional. It was always tied to whether I was useful, whether I made things easier for them, whether I disappeared enough for them to shine. That realization pressed on me like a weight, heavy but clarifying. For the first time, I could see the pattern for what it was, not just a string of unfair moments, but a system that had been in place all along. And as painful as that was to face, it also lit a spark deep inside me. Because once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand the game, you cannot keep playing it the same way. That night after the slap did not just mark the end of my patience. It was the moment I finally admitted to myself that I had been the spare child all along, the one expected to hold everything together but never meant to be celebrated. Knowing that truth hurt, but it also gave me a kind of strength I had never felt before. When I left home for Northwestern, I carried more than just a suitcase. I carried the quiet determination that had been building inside me since childhood, the drive to prove that I could carve out a life that was mine alone. I still remember moving into the dorms, my mother barely offering a hug, telling me to be careful with money, while Veronica stood by yawning as if the entire day was an inconvenience. I did not care. For the first time, the air around me felt like freedom. Northwestern was demanding, but I thrived. I threw myself into finance classes, joined study groups, and learned from professors who had once worked on Wall Street. Every hour I spent in the library, every internship I chased, was fueled by the memory of being overlooked at home. When the scholarship covered my tuition and I picked up side jobs to handle living expenses, I knew I was building a foundation no one could take away from me. By senior year, while some classmates were still figuring out what they wanted, I already had offers lined up. One afternoon in spring, I walked out of a career fair with an invitation to interview at a top consulting firm in Chicago. The adrenaline stayed with me for days. When I got the call that I had been accepted, I sat on the edge of my dorm bed and cried, not from weakness but from the release of years of being underestimated. Graduation came, and while my classmates hugged their families on the lawn, I looked around and saw only Clara standing stiffly in a blazer she had not ironed properly. Veronica had skipped the ceremony, claiming she was busy, though later I saw her tagged in photos at a bar. Mom clapped politely when I walked across the stage, but she spent more time checking her phone than talking to me afterward. Still, I was not crushed. I had a job offer, a future, and I refused to let their indifference dilute what I had earned. The firm in Chicago became my new world. Long hours, high-pressure clients who expected perfection. But I thrived there too. By 27, my salary had crossed into six figures and my bonuses pushed me past $120,000 a year. I bought a one-bedroom condo near the river, nothing extravagant but modern and mine. I decorated it with muted tones, the kind of calm space I had always craved, with a balcony that caught the evening light. It was the first place I ever felt fully at home. Meanwhile, Veronica's path swerved in the opposite direction. She dropped out of community college within a year, saying it was too stressful. She drifted through retail jobs and waitressing until she met David at a bar. He was older, charming in a careless way, and within months, she had moved in with him. By 22, she was married in a rushed courthouse ceremony. No white dress, no grand party, just a quick exchange of vows and a family dinner afterward that felt more like an obligation than a celebration. By 24, she had Lily, and by 26, Ethan followed. On the outside, she smiled in photos, kids perched on her lap, David's arms slung around her shoulders. But behind the smiles, the reality was messier. David never held down a steady job. He floated from construction gigs to bartending, always chasing some side hustle that never worked out. Their apartment was cramped, bills piled up, and I heard the arguments through thin walls when I stopped by. It seemed every few months Veronica called me in tears. The car had broken down, rent was overdue, daycare costs were crushing them. Mom always jumped in to defend her, calling it life's natural hardships. Somehow I became the problem solver, the one asked to loan money to Babysit to rearrange my life to keep theirs afloat. I remember one night vividly. I had just wrapped a presentation for a major client running on 4 hours of sleep, and Veronica called me at midnight. She begged me to come watch the kids because David had stormed out after a fight. I drove across town, sat on their couch while Lily and Ethan slept in their small bedroom, and looked at the pile of unopened bills on the counter. The weight of it pressed on me, and yet when Mom called the next morning, she praised Veronica for being strong, never mentioning that I had been there at all. The contrast between us became impossible to ignore. I was climbing steadily, building a career brick by brick, while she was sinking deeper into chaos. And yet somehow in the family narrative she was still the precious one, the one who needed protecting. I was the reliable background character expected to absorb the overflow. At work, colleagues would ask about my family and I would deflect with vague answers. It was easier than explaining how my success was invisible at home, how the same mother who once dismissed my achievements still found excuses for a daughter who seemed determined to unravel. One Thanksgiving summed it all up perfectly. I had hosted dinner at my condo, spent hours cooking, setting the table with care. Clara sat at the head of the table and spent the evening fussing over Veronica's children, asking her if she was eating enough, praising her for how well she was handling motherhood. At one point, Mom glanced at me and asked if I was dating anyone, then immediately turned back to discuss Veronica's new hair color. I kept my smile fixed in place, but inside I felt that old ache of being invisible. By the time I was 29, the picture was crystal clear. 2 sisters, 2 paths. One with a steady career, a stable home, independence carved from years of discipline. The other drowning in debt, clinging to a husband who could not provide, raising children in an endless cycle of financial and emotional strain. It would have been easy to feel only bitterness about the contrast, but what struck me most was how much it revealed the truth about my family dynamic. Success did not earn me love, and failure did not cost Veronica hers. The scales had always been tilted, and no achievement of mine would ever balance them. That clarity did not make the sting disappear, but it hardened me in a way that would matter later. I no longer chased my mother's approval. I had stopped believing it was even possible. Instead, I began to protect what I had built, to see my life not as an extension of theirs, but as something entirely my own. And still, even with all that resolve, I did not yet realize how far they would go to pull me back into their chaos, or how quickly their demands would push me to the breaking point. It started so small that I hardly noticed it. One afternoon, Veronica called crying because her old sedan had broken down on the way to work. She said the mechanic quoted $200 for the repair, and she swore she would pay me back as soon as David picked up an extra shift. I transferred the money without thinking twice. It felt like nothing more than helping my sister through a bump in the road. But bumps turned into potholes, and soon the road itself was collapsing. A few months later came the call about daycare being overdue, then an electric bill that threatened to cut off service, then car insurance that had lapsed. Each time there was a promise attached, a soft plea that carried my mother's voice behind it. I began to recognize the pattern. Veronica would call, her tone desperate, and within an hour Clara would follow up with her own call, making sure I understood that this was family responsibility, that this was what sisters did for each other. The years blurred together and the amounts grew. By 2020 I was covering more than just occasional bills. I had paid for an emergency room visit when David broke his wrist, for school supplies when Lily started kindergarten, for groceries during the weeks they claimed David's paycheck had been delayed. At first I kept no record, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself things would even out eventually. Then the pandemic hit and everything collapsed further. Veronica lost her part-time job, David drifted between temporary work, and my phone became their lifeline. I paid their rent more than once to keep them from being evicted. I bought them a used washer when theirs broke down. And through it all my mother reminded me in her sharp way that my success meant nothing if I could not share it with family. By 2022 I started to notice how much weight I was carrying, but I did not grasp the full picture until one quiet Sunday afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the sunlight falling across my laptop, and I decided to open a spreadsheet. For the first time, I went back through old bank statements, Venmo transfers, checks I had written. Line after line filled the page, each small amount adding to the last. 200 here, 600 there, 3,000 for rent, 500 for utilities. My chest tightened as the total climbed. By the time I finished adding, the number on the screen read $28,342. I stared at it, my hands cold against the keyboard. That was more than half of what many Americans earned in a year. It was more than the annual salary of teachers, firefighters, people who worked endlessly to make ends meet. And I had given it away silently, without acknowledgement, without thanks. I remember calling Clara that evening, my voice trembling though I tried to steady it. I told her the number, told her I could not believe how much I had spent propping up Veronica and David. There was a pause, a long breath, and then her answer came, sharp and steady. She said it was not about money. She said it was about family duty, about being a good daughter and sister. She told me that having more meant I was meant to share more, that I should not keep score like some accountant tallying receipts. Something inside me cracked at those words. All those years I had been treated as second best, and now the only measure of my worth seemed to be how much I could give away. I hung up quickly, but the words stayed with me, replaying in my head as I lay in bed that night. At work the next day, while reviewing financial models for a client, I found my eyes drifting back to the spreadsheet I had made. I thought about how carefully I tracked every detail for strangers, building strategies worth millions, yet in my own life I had ignored the bleeding of my own finances. That realization stung. Over the following weeks, I began noticing more clearly the expectations that surrounded me. When Veronica mentioned Lily's school trip to Florida, she dropped it into conversation casually, her voice lilting as though she already knew what I would say. She laughed about how expensive it was, how the kids deserved a break, how maybe I could help since I had always loved the beach. Before I could even respond, Clara chimed in later that evening, saying family vacations were memories that lasted forever, saying I should want to give my niece and nephew experiences. And so, against my better judgment, I paid for the tickets, another few thousand disappearing from my account. The cycle continued. Every time I thought I might draw a line, another crisis appeared. Their water heater broke, their credit cards were maxed out, David's license was suspended because of unpaid tickets. It was as if their lives were a leaking roof, and I was expected to hold the umbrella indefinitely. Yet it was that spreadsheet that haunted me. 28,000 in a single year. I pulled it up again and again, staring at the number, the neat column of expenses that told a story my family refused to acknowledge. It was not just generosity. It was exploitation disguised as love. One evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat with the document open, reading through each entry like scars carved into my balance sheet. I whispered the numbers aloud, hearing the accumulation in my own voice. And in that moment, I felt something shift. I was not angry only at Veronica or David. I was angry at myself for letting it go so far, for allowing guilt and obligation to blind me. The awareness did not erase the history, but it lit a fuse inside me. For the first time, I began to see clearly what had been taken and how much more they might try to take if I did not stop it. That night, I closed the laptop slowly, the glow of the screen fading into darkness. I sat in silence, the city humming faintly outside my window, and I knew the reckoning was coming sooner than I had ever imagined. The following weekend, I found myself back at my mother's house, the same living room that had hosted so many strained gatherings over the years. The air smelled faintly of pot roast and lemon polish, and the television murmured in the background. Veronica sat on the couch, her hair pulled into a loose bun, eyes shining in a way that immediately made me wary. She spread glossy brochures across the coffee table like a magician, revealing cards. "Look at this net," she said, sliding one toward me. "The Maldives. Overwater villas, white sand beaches, private pools. Can you even imagine?" David found a package that's almost too good to be true. I picked up the brochure, its bright images of turquoise water and infinity pools reflecting back at me. For a second, I let myself sink into the pictures, the fantasy of walking barefoot across a deck above the ocean, the sun painting the horizon in gold. But the spell broke when I saw the way Clara was looking at me from her recliner. Her expression wasn't dreamy, it was expectant. "You know, this is exactly the kind of experience young couples need," Clara said, her voice steady and certain. "Time to recharge, reconnect. And of course Natalie will help make it possible. She can stay with the kids while they go." I blinked. The words landed heavy. Not only was I not being invited, I was being assigned. It wasn't a question, it was a decree. David leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "The deal ends in 3 days. Flights and a villa all included, and right now it's 30% off. We only need about 6,000 more to lock it in." He smiled like a man pitching an investment. "It's practically a steal." The number echoed in my ears. 6,000. I thought of my spreadsheet, the 28,000 I had already poured into them in a single year. My stomach twisted. Veronica clapped her hands together, her voice lilting. "And the best part, the kids will be with someone they know and love. They'll barely notice we're gone." She said it like it was already settled. I tried to picture it. 2 weeks of juggling Lily's soccer practices, Ethan's tantrums, meals, bedtime routines, while I kept up with my demanding job. All while they sipped cocktails above clear blue water. The injustice rose in me like heat. I set the brochure back on the table. "So let me understand. You're asking me to take time off work, watch the kids full-time, and pay thousands of dollars for you to have this trip?" Clara gave a sharp laugh, the kind that cut more than it amused. "Don't be dramatic, Natalie. Nobody said you had to take time off. You can work from here. You're single, you have no real obligations. Who else are you living for if not family?" Her words landed like stones, familiar and cruel. I felt my chest tighten. I glanced at Veronica, waiting for her to at least acknowledge how absurd it sounded, but she only smiled and leaned into David. "It's not like we're asking you to come with us," Veronica said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've always been the responsible one. You can handle it." That phrase, "you can handle it," scraped against me. I had handled everything for years. Their bills, their emergencies, their endless needs. And now apparently their dream vacation. I swallowed hard, forcing calm into my voice. $6,000 is not pocket change, and I already contribute plenty. You can't expect me to just... My voice trailed off, but the silence said enough. David shifted uncomfortably, his salesman's smile faltering. Veronica, however, kept her tone light, almost sing-song. "Come on, Nat. Think about it. You'd be giving us memories we'll cherish forever. Isn't that worth more than money?" Clara's eyes narrowed at me, sharp and commanding. "Stop acting like you're a victim. This is what family does. You have a good salary, a nice apartment, no husband, no children. You think you built that all on your own number. You were raised with our support, and now it's your turn to support your sister. That's how families survive." The unfairness pressed down on me so hard I wanted to scream. My father had been the one who encouraged me, the one who told me education would free me. And he was gone. The woman speaking now was not giving me support, she was draining me. I pressed my hands against my knees, grounding myself. In that moment, I realized this was not just about the Maldives. It was about every dinner bill I had covered, every check I had written, every ounce of guilt they had fed me since I was old enough to earn. But I also knew better than to explode in that living room. They would twist my anger into selfishness, my resistance into betrayal. So I stayed quiet, staring at the glossy photo of a villa above the ocean, the water so clear you could see fish beneath the deck. I let them talk over me, weaving fantasies of snorkeling, sunset, cruises, cocktails under the stars. Inside, though, something shifted. I felt a slow burn ignite in my chest. It was the beginning of resistance, small but unmistakable. When I finally stood to leave, Veronica hugged me loosely, whispering that she would text me the payment details just in case I changed my mind. Clara kissed my cheek and told me not to disappoint the family. David gave a half smile that already assumed victory. I walked out into the cool Chicago night, the streetlights glowing against the pavement. I breathed deeply, the air sharp in my lungs, and I made a quiet promise to myself. They thought I would bend the way I always had. But this time I was already calculating how not to. The brochures stayed on their coffee table, the dream was theirs. The burden they assumed was mine. But as I unlocked my car, a thought flickered through me, steady and defiant. Not anymore. A few nights later, my doorbell rang just as I was settling in with a cup of tea. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I looked through the peephole, Veronica and David stood in the hallway smiling like they were delivering good news. I almost didn't open the door, but hesitation only prolonged the inevitable, so I turned the lock and let them in. They walked straight to the living room, David carrying a folder, Veronica clutching her phone. She dropped onto the couch like she owned the place. David spread papers across my coffee table. "We worked out the details," Veronica said brightly. 2 weeks in the Maldives. It's perfect timing with the kids out of school. You'll stay here, work remotely, and watch Lily and Ethan. We'll be back before you know it. David pointed at the numbers on the page as if presenting a business pitch. Flights, villa transfers, even excursions. All we need is for you to cover childcare while we're away. It makes sense, Natalie. You're stable. You don't have a family of your own yet. Who better than you to step in for family? The words hung heavy in the air. I stared at the printouts, at the glossy photo of a villa framed by palm trees. My chest tightened. I leaned back, keeping my voice steady. I can't do it. I can't take 2 weeks out of my life to raise your kids while you're on vacation. I have work. I have responsibilities. Veronica's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She tilted her head, her tone softening like she was offering me a kindness. Nat, you work from a laptop. You can do that from anywhere, even from here. The kids love you. It won't be that hard. I pressed my palms together. It is hard. It's not my responsibility. You're asking me to be a full-time parent while you disappear. That's not fair. David tried to smooth the tension, leaning forward. Think about it from our perspective. We haven't had a real trip since Ethan was born. We need this. And you're the only one who can help. We're family. Isn't that what matters? I shook my head. I'm not saying no to helping at all. Hire a nanny. I'll even pitch in $1,000 to offset the cost. But I will not do 2 weeks alone. That's not helping, that's sacrificing myself. Veronica's eyes darkened. Her voice sharpened. So, you'll throw money at the problem but not actually be there for us. Do you hear how selfish that sounds? The words stung, but I stood my ground. What's selfish is expecting me to drop everything while you sip cocktails in paradise. I've done more than enough. I can't keep draining myself to make your life easier. Veronica glanced at David, then back at me. You think success makes you better than us. That's what this is about. You sit up here in your nice apartment and look down on us. The accusation made my blood run hot. I rose from my chair, my voice rising. This is not about being better. This is about boundaries. I'm done being your solution for every crisis. I'm not your bank. I'm not your nanny. I'm your sister. And I'm saying no. The silence that followed was electric. Veronica's lips trembled, not from sadness but from rage. She snatched up her phone. Fine. If you won't listen to me, maybe you'll listen to Mom. Before I could stop her, she dialed. She put the phone on speaker. Clara's voice filled my apartment. "What is going on?" Clara asked. "Mom," Veronica said quickly, her voice breaking like a rehearsed performance. "Natalie's refusing to help us. She said she won't watch the kids, she won't even consider it. We'll lose the trip if she doesn't step up." Clara didn't hesitate. "Natalie, what is wrong with you? How could you be so cold? This is your family. Your sister needs you. You don't have children. You don't have a husband. What else are you doing that's so important?" My throat burned. "I have a job, Mom. I have a life that doesn't revolve around being at everyone's beck and call. I've done everything you've ever asked. I've paid bills, covered debts, babysat for free. When is it ever enough?" Clara's tone sharpened, slicing through the room. "You're ungrateful. Everything you have because we raised you. And now when it's your turn you refuse. Shame on you." I felt my hands shaking, but I didn't back down. "I'm not a child anymore. I don't owe my adulthood to you like some endless debt. I've built my own life. And I'm telling you no. I will not give up 2 weeks and thousands of dollars so they can run off to the Maldives. Hire a nanny. I'll help with part of it, that's all I'm offering." The silence that followed was suffocating. Veronica's eyes glittered with fury. David sat rigid beside her, and from the phone Clara's breathing grew heavier. Finally Clara spat the word like a curse. "Selfish." Then the line went dead. The quiet that followed felt heavier than shouting. I stood there, the hum of my refrigerator, the only sound. My chest heaved with every breath. Veronica gathered the brochures and papers, her movements sharp. She shoved them into her bag, muttering under her breath. David avoided my eyes. As they walked out, Veronica paused in the doorway. She looked back at me, her face twisted with anger. "You'll regret this, Nat. You always do." I didn't respond. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it, my heart pounding. For the first time in years, I had drawn a line. In the stillness of my apartment, with the echoes of their voices still in the air, I felt both terrified and free. The invitation came 2 days later in the form of a group text from Clara, short and commanding. "Dinner at Maison du Lac Friday, 7 p.m. No question mark, no suggestion, just a statement." Maison du Lac was the kind of French restaurant people saved up for months to afford, with starched white linens and chandeliers dripping with light. I stared at the message for a long time before typing a simple okay. Friday night I put on a navy dress, simple but sharp, and drove downtown. The streets glowed with the orange of late summer evenings in Chicago, people spilling onto patios with glasses of wine. Inside the restaurant, the air was cool and humming with quiet conversation. A host led me to a round table near the center of the dining room. Veronica was already seated in a sparkling blouse, David beside her in a jacket that didn't quite fit. Clara sat at the head of the table, swirling a glass of Bordeaux like she had been born in Paris. They were all smiles as I slid into my chair, though the smiles didn't reach their eyes. Veronica leaned across the table. "We went ahead and ordered a few things. Hope that's fine." The waiter appeared almost instantly with appetizers, foie gras, oysters on ice, a plate of escargot. None of it cheap. Veronica flipped through the wine list as if it were her personal menu and told the server to bring another bottle of the same Bordeaux Clara was already enjoying. David studied the entree section. "We'll have the filet mignon medium rare. And the duck confit." He glanced at me like he was doing me a favor. "You'll like that, Nat." My jaw tightened. They hadn't asked what I wanted. I picked up the menu myself and ordered salmon, clear and firm, just to remind them I still had a voice. Dinner carried on with a strange brightness. Veronica talked about school plays Lily might audition for. David rambled about a possible promotion. Clara sipped her wine and smiled like she was watching a performance unfold exactly as she had written it. I kept my eyes on the tablecloth, cutting small bites, waiting for the inevitable shift. It came after the main courses were cleared, just as the server poured coffee. Veronica stood lifting her glass with exaggerated grace. The restaurant quieted slightly, the way rooms do when someone clearly wants attention. "I want to make a little toast," she began. Her eyes sparkled, her voice carrying across the tables nearby. "To my sister Natalie. The most generous, dependable woman I know. She has agreed to watch Lily and Ethan while David and I finally take our dream trip to the Maldives. Applause did not come. Instead, there was a faint clink of silverware as people at nearby tables shifted, sensing tension. My heart pounded. Heat spread up my neck. I pushed back my chair, slowly rising to my feet. That is not true, I said clearly. My voice rang sharper than I expected. I never agreed to watch your children. I never agreed to finance your vacation. Stop lying. The words landed like stones in water, sending ripples through the room. Veronica froze, her smile cracking. David looked down at his hands. Clara's wineglass trembled slightly as she set it down. The silence deepened. I could feel eyes on us from every direction. My breath shook, but I held my ground. Veronica tried to recover, laughing too loudly. Oh, come on, Nat, don't be so dramatic. Everyone knows you're always there for us. She's just being modest. I'm not being modest, I said, my voice louder now. I'm telling the truth. I never agreed. Stop pretending I did. Clara's chair scraped against the hardwood as she stood. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed. She stepped close, the scent of wine heavy on her breath. Natalie, sit down and stop embarrassing us. I won't sit down, I said, my voice steady, even as my hands trembled. I won't let you announce my life like it belongs to you. Her hand rose faster than I could process. The sound came first sharp and echoing like a whip crack in the hushed dining room. My cheek burned instantly, the sting radiating through my skin. The entire restaurant went silent. Forks hovered midair. Conversations halted. All I could hear was my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I stood there frozen, my cheek blazing, my body rigid with shock. The shame rushed in like a flood. A woman at the next table gasped. A waiter dropped a tray. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Clara's hand still hovered in the air for a second before she lowered it, her chest heaving. Maybe now you'll learn respect, she hissed. I stared at her, at Veronica, clutching her wine glass, with wide eyes at David shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The humiliation pressed down on me heavier than anything I had carried before. My throat felt raw, but no words came. I reached for my clutch, my fingers numb, and placed $100 bill on the table for my salmon. My voice finally broke free, low and steady. I pay for myself. Nothing more. Then I turned and walked away. My heels clicked against the marble floor, the only sound in the vacuum of silence that stretched behind me. As I reached the door, I felt every pair of eyes in the restaurant following me, not with admiration or pity, but with disbelief at the spectacle they had just witnessed. Outside, the night air hit me like ice, cooling the fire in my cheek, but not the rage in my chest. I stood for a moment under the golden glow of the street lamps, drawing breath after shaky breath, trying to steady myself. That slap was more than humiliation. It was a declaration of war. I walked into my apartment that night and flicked on the bathroom light. The harsh glow bounced off the mirror, and there it was, an angry red mark blooming across my cheek. I leaned closer, tracing the faint outline of her hand with trembling fingers. For years I had carried their words, their expectations, their demands, but this was different. This was violence, plain and undeniable. My phone buzzed on the counter. At first I ignored it, too drained to speak to anyone, but it kept vibrating until I picked it up. Rachel's name lit the screen. She was a colleague from the firm, someone sharp and steady who had seen me hold my ground in negotiations more ruthless than most families would ever understand. Her voice was careful but firm. "Natalie, I was there. I saw what she did. That wasn't just ugly family drama. That was assault." The word landed like a weight in my chest. Assault. I opened my mouth to argue, to minimize it, but nothing came. My reflection stared back at me, daring me to keep pretending. Rachel continued. "There are witnesses. The place had cameras. You don't have to keep letting them do this to you. Call a lawyer. Please." I sank onto the closed toilet seat, pressing the phone to my ear. "It's my mother, Rachel," I whispered. "Who sues their own mother?" She didn't flinch. "A woman who refuses to let her dignity be erased. Think about it. This isn't just about you. It's about what you're allowing if you stay silent." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long time. Then another buzz lit the screen. A text message. Samantha, my younger cousin. She had always been half and half out of family gatherings, her mother, careful to keep some distance from Clara's orbit. The message was short but cutting. No one has the right to hit a grown woman. Not even your mother. Especially not her. I stared at the words until they blurred. No one had ever said it to me so plainly. I was used to excuses to she didn't mean it or that's just how she is. But Samantha's clarity sliced through the fog. The next morning, I called the number Rachel had sent me. Hayes and Belle Law Loop District. I set the appointment for that afternoon, my stomach twisting as I slipped into a blazer and walked into the glass building downtown. The office smelled faintly of leather and old books, the kind of place designed to make you feel both small and taken seriously. A receptionist guided me into a room where a man in his 40s extended his hand. Miss Carter, I'm Daniel Hayes. Have a seat. He listened as I told him everything, his pen scratching across a yellow legal pad. I described the dinner, the toast, my refusal, the slap that followed. I told him about Rachel, about Samantha's text, about the strangers in the restaurant who gasped. When I finished, he set the pen down and folded his hands. This is a clear case of civil assault and battery, he said calmly. Your mother struck you in public in front of multiple witnesses and likely under video surveillance. The restaurant has security cameras. That evidence is strong. I swallowed hard. She's my mother. His gaze didn't soften. She is also a person who committed an unlawful act. You deserve the same protections any adult would. If a stranger had done this to you in that restaurant, would you hesitate? My mind flashed back to the sting, the hush of the dining room, the humiliation that burned deeper than my cheek. No, I admitted quietly. Then the law shouldn't hesitate either, Hayes said. You have options. We can pursue damages for emotional distress and medical costs if needed. This isn't about money, though. I imagine you have shouldered more than enough financial abuse already. This is about drawing a line. His words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I thought of the years of checks written, of tuition covered, of bills paid in silence. I thought of Clara's voice declaring my obligations like scripture and Veronica's laugh as she lifted her wine glass. Hayes slid a form across the desk. This authorizes us to act on your behalf. It doesn't commit you to trial today, but it signals that you are ready to stop absorbing the blows. Figuratively and literally. I stared at the paper. My hand shook slightly as I picked up the pen. I imagined Clara's face, the outrage that would twist her mouth when she realized the rules had changed. I imagined Veronica scrambling to spin the story, David shrinking back as usual. For once, I wasn't thinking about them. I was thinking about me. About the part of me that had been silenced with every dollar handed over, with every insult swallowed. About the part that had been told since childhood I was less worthy, less deserving. My signature curved across the page. Bold final mine. Hayes nodded once. Good. We'll begin by requesting the footage from the restaurant and reaching out to key witnesses. Rachel, you said, was present. Your cousin as well. We'll also obtain records of prior financial contributions you've made if you're willing to share them. It paints a broader picture of coercion. I breathed out slowly, a weight leaving my chest. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I felt like I wasn't just reacting. I was acting. When I stepped back out onto the street, the sun was still high over the skyline, the wind off Lake Michigan sharp against my face. My cheek was no longer red, but I knew the memory of it would never fade. Still, something inside me had shifted. I was no longer the daughter who paid silently, no longer the sister who carried burdens that weren't hers. I was a woman who had finally put her foot down in the only language they could not ignore. I clutched the copy of the signed papers against my chest as I walked toward the train, the city buzzing around me. For the first time in years, the noise didn't drown me. It carried me forward. The summons went out 3 days later. Hayes called me that morning to let me know the papers had been served. By the time I sat down at my desk at work, the phone was already buzzing. Aunts, cousins, even an old neighbor had left me voicemails dripping with disbelief. I ignored them all. That evening, Clara exploded online. A photo of her sitting on the couch, tears streaking her face, appeared on her Facebook page. Her caption read, "My own daughter's suing me over one little slap. Pray for me." I don't know how a mother can survive this kind of betrayal. The comments poured in like a flood. Family friends offered sympathy. Church acquaintances typed long prayers. A few even hinted that I must be greedy or worse, mentally unstable. I stared at the screen, a knot forming in my stomach. Clara had always been good at twisting the story, but seeing it spread publicly was something else entirely. She wasn't just defending herself. She was painting me as the villain for the whole world to see. By the next day, Veronica added fuel to the fire. She posted a picture of Lily and Ethan sitting on the living room floor, tears streaming down their cheeks, holding their stuffed animals. Her caption read, "This is what happens when Aunt Natalie abandons her family to drag our mother into court. My children are heartbroken." Then came the live stream. Veronica sat in her kitchen, her voice trembling with practiced emotion, while David hovered in the background. She spoke directly into the camera, claiming that all I cared about was money and that I was tearing the family apart for attention. She held up Lily, who clung to her shirt, and whispered, "Tell everyone how much you miss Grandma." The child only looked confused, but it was enough to send dozens of viewers into a frenzy of outrage. My phone filled with notifications. Messages from extended relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years appeared overnight. Some called me selfish. Others told me to apologize and drop the case before it ruined the family name. There were a few, just a few, who reached out quietly to say they supported me. Samantha wrote again, this time in a private message, "Ignore the noise. They are trying to manipulate everyone the same way they manipulated you for years. Stay strong." Her words steadied me for a moment, but the tidal wave of condemnation kept pressing in. At the office, Rachel pulled me aside. "You don't owe anyone explanations," she said firmly. "Let them scream. The law will speak louder than Facebook." Still, the pressure was immense. Walking to the train one evening, I caught two acquaintances whispering when they spotted me. One said, "That's the girl who sued her mom." The other shook her head like she was looking at a stranger. I kept moving, clutching my bag tighter, pretending their voices were just wind. But when I reached my apartment, I leaned against the door and let the silence swallow me. This was the cost. Not just money or time, but reputation, perception, belonging. Hayes called again that week. "They're playing it publicly," he said, "but remember, the courtroom isn't Facebook. We have evidence. Witnesses. Video. They know it too. That's why they're lashing out." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "It feels like everyone hates me." He was quiet for a moment. "Not everyone. And the ones who do, ask yourself why. If they think humiliation and violence are acceptable, their opinion doesn't hold much weight, does it?" I wanted to believe him. I tried to believe him. But each night the noise online grew louder, each post more dramatic than the last. Clara shared old photos of us smiling at Christmas, writing long captions about how she had always sacrificed for her daughters, how she could not understand why one had turned so cruel. I remembered those holidays differently. I remembered Veronica unwrapping expensive gifts while I got sweaters bought on clearance. I remembered clearing dishes while the others laughed in the living room. Now the world was being told another version. And once again I was cast as the ungrateful child. At work, Rachel closed my office door one afternoon. "You look exhausted," she said. "Have you been sleeping?" "Not much," I admitted. Every time I close my eyes, I see the comments. I hear her voice calling me a traitor. Rachel's eyes softened. "You did the right thing. Don't let them rewrite the truth. People who want to believe lies will always believe them. You know what really happened." Her certainty calmed me, at least for the moment. That night, I logged out of Facebook and silenced the group chats. The phone still vibrated now and then, but I refused to look. Instead, I sat by the window watching the trains rattle past in the distance, the city lights blinking like stubborn stars. The noise was everywhere, but inside me something different was taking root. A stillness. A clarity. They could cry and post and beg for sympathy, but I knew what they had done, and I knew that silence would never protect me again. As the weekend came, I braced myself for the next storm. Monday morning dawned gray and damp, the kind of Chicago morning where the air itself feels heavy. I put on a navy dress and a black blazer, hands trembling slightly as I fastened the buttons. Hayes had told me to keep it simple, professional, respectful. As I rode the train downtown, the city blurred outside the window, my reflection staring back at me with eyes I barely recognized. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Marble floors echoed with every step, and the smell of paper and disinfectant lingered. Hayes met me in the lobby, his tie perfectly knotted, his calm presence, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside me. He gave me a reassuring nod, as if to say, "You are not alone." Inside the courtroom, rows of wooden benches creaked as people sat. A few distant relatives had come, some out of curiosity, others maybe to take sides. I didn't look for Veronica or Clara, but I felt their presence before I saw them. When I finally glanced up, my mother was there at the defendant's table, her lips pressed tight, her hands folded too neatly in her lap. Veronica sat behind her arms, crossed her eyes, shooting daggers at me. The judge entered and we all rose. My pulse thudded in my ears. Hayes began calmly presenting the timeline. He spoke of the dinner, the argument, the slap. He described not just the physical act but the humiliation of it happening in a public place. This was not discipline, he told the court. This was an adult woman being struck and degraded by her mother in front of strangers. Then came the witnesses. A couple who had been sitting at the table near ours that night stepped forward. The woman spoke first, her voice steady. She described how Veronica had made an announcement, how I had objected, and how my mother had suddenly stood and slapped me across the face. It was loud, she said. The whole restaurant went quiet. Everyone stared. She just hit her. No hesitation. Her husband nodded, confirming every detail. It wasn't playful or private. It was aggressive. Everyone saw it. My throat tightened as I listened. Hearing strangers repeat the story brought the shame back in waves, but it also lit something else inside me: validation. I had not imagined it. I had not exaggerated it. Then Hayes wheeled in a screen. He pressed play on the restaurant's security footage. The grainy video flickered to life, showing the wide shot of the dining area. There we were, frozen in time. The announcement, my protest. And then the moment. My mother's hand connecting with my face, my head jerking to the side. The sound wasn't recorded, but the violence of the gesture was unmistakable. The courtroom went silent. No coughs, no shuffling papers, just silence so thick it pressed on my skin. Clara's attorney stood, trying to soften the blow. She argued that it was an emotional evening, that Clara was a mother trying to correct her daughter in the heat of the moment. Clara herself finally spoke, her voice shaking with anger masked as sorrow. I didn't mean to hurt her. She is my daughter. I was disciplining her like any parent would. Sometimes children need to be reminded of respect. Hayes rose slowly, his eyes sharp. She is not a child. She is a 30-year-old woman. And respect cannot be beaten into someone in a crowded restaurant. His words hung in the air like a gavel already struck. I looked at Clara, then really looked. Her eyes were wet, but not with regret. It was fury, the kind she used to unleash on me behind closed doors. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry it had been seen. Hours dragged by with motions and counter-arguments, but the weight of that video never left the room. Even Veronica, usually so loud and sure, kept shifting in her seat, her jaw clenched. When the judge finally spoke, the tension broke like glass shattering. She leaned forward, her voice measured and clear. This court finds that the act in question was not a matter of parental discipline but an assault on an adult daughter. It was public, intentional, and humiliating. The defendant is ordered to issue a formal public apology and pay damages to cover both emotional harm and the plaintiff's legal costs. I couldn't breathe. My chest lifted and sank as though the air had thickened. The words kept echoing: assault, apology, damages. Clara's face drained of color. For the first time, she looked small, as if the weight of her own actions had finally caught her. Veronica grabbed her arm, whispering harshly, but the judge had already dismissed the case. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and it was over. Tears stung my eyes unbidden. I pressed a tissue against my face, not caring that a few people were watching. It wasn't victory that overwhelmed me. It was a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief that the truth had been recognized. Grief that it had taken a courtroom and strangers to validate what I had been saying my whole life. Hayes touched my shoulder gently as people began filing out. "You did it," he said. I nodded, unable to form words. My voice was buried somewhere deep beneath the tide of emotions. As I stepped into the hallway, the sound of footsteps echoed off the stone walls. My heart was still pounding, but the storm that had lived inside me for weeks had begun at last to settle. And in that quiet, I felt the faintest hint of peace, fragile but real, waiting for what would come next. Word traveled quickly after the ruling. In a city like Chicago, where reputations move faster than the trains, Clara's fall from grace was swift. Friends she had once entertained with gossip and expensive wine stopped calling. The women from her church group who used to praise her for being such a devoted mother began avoiding her at the grocery store. Even her hair clients at the little home salon she sometimes ran quietly canceled appointments. I heard about it not through her but through whispers that found their way back to me. Clara had always prided herself on her image, and now that image was fractured. For Veronica and David, the Maldives trip never happened. The glossy brochures, the ocean villas, the infinity pools, they vanished into nothing but a cancelled reservation and a lost deposit. David had been the one to put the deposit on his credit card, convinced Natalie would cover the rest, and when I refused, he and Veronica scrambled. By the time they realized I would not back down, the cancellation fees ate thousands. Their dream vacation dissolved into resentment and arguments, and I heard from Samantha that they even fought about it in front of the kids. I had drawn my line clearly. No more insurance payments, no more utility bills covered in silence. No more tuition checks slipping under their doors as though love could be measured in money. The spreadsheet that had once made me dizzy now became my shield. I closed every tab that had their names, canceled the autopay accounts, and told myself I was free. Veronica tried to call me at first, her tone swinging wildly between anger and desperation. The kids' health insurance lapsed. You know how expensive prescriptions are. You're really going to let your niece and nephew suffer? Her words were like knives meant to stab guilt back into me. I listened quietly, then told her I would not cover what their parents should. If Lily or Ethan ever needed me in an emergency, I would be there as their aunt, but no longer as the family bank. Veronica hung up on me sobbing, and for the first time I did not call back. Reality came quickly for them. Veronica, once too proud to take what she called a desk job, ended up applying at a small law office downtown as an administrative assistant. The pay was modest, the hours long, and she had to swallow every ounce of pride to accept it. David, whose car sales commissions had been declining for months, was assigned more weekend shifts. He worked late, the fluorescent lights of the dealership replacing the neon bar lights where he had once found her. Their voices, once so loud and demanding what they thought I owed, grew quieter. It was as if cutting the financial cord had muted them. And yet the ones who bore none of the blame were Lily and Ethan. One Saturday afternoon, just weeks after the ruling, I met them at Lincoln Park Zoo. Veronica dropped them off without a word, her eyes darting past me as though I were invisible. Lily ran to me first, her arms wrapping around my waist. Ethan followed, his little hand gripping mine as though afraid I might vanish too. We spent the day watching sea lions, splash lions, does, and monkeys swing between ropes. For hours I let them chatter, ask questions, and laugh without thinking of bills or betrayals. I bought them ice cream cones, and we sat on a bench under the warm sun, their sticky fingers clutching mine. That was when Lily's voice softened. "Aunt Natalie," she asked, her eyes wide, "do you still love us, even if Mom says you don't?" My chest tightened. I crouched down, looking into both their faces, so innocent, so undeserving of the chaos the adults had built around them. "Of course I love you. Nothing you hear from anyone will ever change that. I love you with all my heart, and I will always be here for you." Ethan frowned, his voice small. "But we heard Mom say you left us. That you don't want us anymore." I shook my head slowly. "I will never leave you. Sometimes grown-ups fight and they say things that are not true. But my love for you is true. That will never change." They seemed to soften, then leaning against me. For the rest of the afternoon, we wandered through the exhibits, their laughter louder than their worries. I felt something I hadn't in months, the clarity that I could separate my love for them from the wreckage of their parents' choices. Clara, Veronica, and David carried their own burdens now. No more whispered demands. No more slaps disguised as lessons. They faced their bills, their jobs, their consequences. And I faced my reflection with something new. For years, I had been the one to carry everyone else. Now standing alone, I realized that sometimes love means stepping back, letting others stumble so they can learn to stand. The peace that had begun in the courtroom followed me into those quiet afternoons at the park and museum. With Lily and Ethan's hands in mine, I knew I had not lost everything. I had only let go of what was never mine to carry. Work became more than a routine. It became a place where I poured the energy I used to waste on putting out family fires. At the Chicago design firm where I had spent years building my reputation, my projects began to shine in ways even I had not expected. Late nights refining proposals and long days balancing client demands finally paid off when my director called me into her office. She looked me square in the eye and told me I was being promoted to lead a new division. For the first time in a long time, my worth was measured not by what I gave away, but by what I built with my own hands. Andrew had been by my side through the storm, patient in ways that made me realize how rare respect could be. He was a landscape architect, someone who saw possibility in barren spaces. He never tried to control me or tell me what I should do. Instead, he created room for me to breathe. We would meet after work, sometimes walking along the river or sitting quietly in his garden while he sketched ideas in his notebook. Our relationship grew not from dependence but from trust. I had been so used to giving until I was empty, but with him I learned what it felt like to receive without debt attached. Therapy remained a constant too. Dr. Jessica reminded me week after week that guilt is not proof of love. It is proof of manipulation when it has no foundation. She guided me through the messy layers of my past, helping me untangle the belief that being a good daughter or sister meant endless sacrifice. Slowly, the sessions helped me replace guilt with boundaries, shame with clarity. There were days I left her office with tears, but they were tears that came from relief, not despair. Life did not suddenly become easy. Veronica still sent short, curt texts about the kids, and Clara occasionally tried to bait me into arguments, but I no longer felt their pull the way I once did. Their chaos no longer had a claim on me. I saw them for what they were, adults who had to carry their own responsibilities. And while I never closed the door on Lily and Ethan, I no longer allowed that door to become a gateway for their parents to walk through with demands. One evening, Andrew and I drove to the shore of Lake Michigan. The sky stretched wide, painted in layers of orange, pink, and deepening purple. The waves rolled against the rocks, steady and calm, as if the lake itself had lessons to teach about persistence and peace. We spread out a blanket, opened a small picnic basket, and sat quietly while the city lights flickered to life behind us. I thought about the journey that had brought me there, about the nights I lay awake wondering how I had become nothing more than an ATM with a beating heart. I remembered the humiliation in that restaurant, the sting of my mother's hand on my face, the silence of family who chose to believe I owed them everything. And I remembered the day I chose to fight back, not with anger alone, but with the truth of my own worth. As the sun dipped lower, I turned to Andrew and said softly that I finally understood something. My value had never come from the money I provided, the bills I paid, or the vacations I funded. It came from the work I built, the love I gave freely, and the strength I carried through every betrayal. It came from knowing when to say no and when to walk away. He smiled at me, quiet but steady, and squeezed my hand. In that moment, I felt whole. Not because everything was perfect, but because I no longer needed perfection to feel free. The waves whispered against the shore as the last of the light faded. I leaned back, letting the cool breeze wrap around me, and thought of Lily and Ethan, of the children who still ran into my arms with laughter untainted by the mistakes of the adults around them. They were reminders that love can survive even when loyalty breaks, that family can be chosen not by blood but by action. I had gone from being the bank in the shadows to a woman who knew her boundaries, her strength, and her value. The weight I had carried for so long was gone, and in its place was a quiet certainty I was no longer theirs to drain. I was my own. As I sat there watching the horizon blur into night, I knew my story was not just mine. So many carry the same hidden burdens, giving until they are empty, believing love is only proven through sacrifice. If you have ever felt used or diminished by the very people who should have protected you, know this. No one has the right to strip away your worth, not even your own family. Tell me, have you ever been in that place where your love was mistaken for obligation? Share your story, because together we remind each other of a truth too often forgotten. You are valuable not for what you give away, but for who you are. And no one, not even those bound by blood, can take that away.